Listen close, it's the occult folks. It's the occult folks. It's the occult folks.
Welcome to the show. Today we have Gary Lachman. He is the author of a number of fantastic books, a few of which I continuously hear referenced through other work, and also a former member of the band Blondie. So, Gary, thank you so much for taking the time and being here with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yes, sir. So, what kind of got you into the whole interest in becoming an author and this type of research?
I always wanted to be a writer for some reason. Um, when I was an adolescent, I guess early teens, it was poetry. I wanted to write poetry, and I did write some. Wasn't very good, but I wrote quite a bit of it. But this would have been late 1960s into early 70s, so it's from, listening to a lot of, pop songs, and lyrics were important then, like Dylan's and
Yeah.
John Lennon's and some other folk. I couldn't play the musical instrument at that point, but I knew a lot of people in my mid-teens. I knew a lot of people who did in high school. So I was in that milieu, but I was one of the people who like knew the lyrics and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And that got transformed into playing in Blondie. Uh, 19 early 1975 or late 74. Clem Burke was the drummer, is the drummer. Blondie, I knew him from high school. We went to
Okay.
high school together.
Wow.
And he used to play in bands, high school bands, and I used to go see him play, like, do Santana covers or the Allman Brothers or
Hmm.
things like that.
Yeah.
But he was always into the next big thing, whatever was, coming up, and he got into glitter and Bowie and things like that before most of the people, at least where we were in New Jersey,
Yeah.
were into it. And so he started playing in bands doing that kind of thing. And then he saw an ad in the Village Voice, which used to be this underground newspaper in New York. I don't know if it's still around or not. It's probably a freebie by now.
Hmm.
But this was Debbie Harry put an ad in for a drummer because she had tried to get something going for a while, and they kept losing musicians, and so he started playing with them. And then I was living in New York. I started living in New York when I was 18 and writing this bad poetry and working as a messenger. Oddly enough, I've just finished doing the copy editing on a memoir that's going to come out later this year, which is about how I went from playing in Blondie and playing. And I had my own band for a while, and then I played with Iggy Pop for a while too. And then a long stretch after I left that until I started writing and publishing. So how that all happened. So a lot of
Yeah.
this stuff's fresh in my mind. But and yeah, so I started going to the gigs Clem was doing with the Blondie then, or the beginnings of it, and then they lost their bass player, fellow named Fred Smith, and he was advised by Patti Smith to join Tom Verlaine's band Television because they just lost their bass player, Richard Hell, he's the guy who actually invented punk rock. He was the first one to wear the ripped T-shirts before
Yeah.
Malcolm McLaren saw him and stole the idea and took it back to England. So the original Television was Verlaine and Hell, and then Hell left. And so he and Johnny Thunders from the New York Dolls started a band called the Heartbreakers. And Fred Smith left Blondie to take Hell's place in Television. And so Clem asked me, if I wanted to audition because, like, I was after hanging out with lots of musicians, you kind of pick up things, and at that point, you didn't have to be a great musician. Even if you knew three chords, that was good. So I was bass, which is you don't even need to know chords. You just need, one string at a time down on the neck. So I
Yeah.
figured that one out. And so I just auditioned, for them. And this would have been early 75. So
Hmm.
practically 50 years ago now, short a couple months. And yeah, I just started playing with them. And then at one point, um, we got this loft space on the Bowery in New York, and back when it was the Bowery. Nowadays it isn't. It's just incredibly overpriced everything there, and it was a space about a block and a half from CBGB from the club,
Wow.
um, and the guy who had sort of the lease on this. It was like three floors. He rented us a floor, and he had a floor, and there was another one. He's this wild, flamboyant gay biker artist who was really into the Hells Angels, but also into Aleister Crowley and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I had no interest in any of this kind of thing. The only thing about the occult that I was interested in was from like reading H.P. Lovecraft and horror fiction or the old Universal horror films from the 30s and the 40s and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
um, but I just started getting into it because he would do these impromptu readings from the tarot cards, and he would read from Crowley, his novel Diary of a Drug Fiend, and of course because it was about drugs, that was interesting. And then another book I read at the time, which really cliche is, but that's how it is. It changed my life. Is a book just called The Occult. It's by a British writer named Colin Wilson, who died in 2013. And that book was written in the early 70s, and it just was so well written. And I didn't know at the time, but Wilson had a whole career before then writing about existentialism and philosophy and things of that sort.
Mhm.
And so he brought that kind of tone and that kind of interest in ideas. And fundamentally, it was, I mean, at the time, I just was, wow. But fundamentally, I came to understand it's about consciousness. And that's what I've been writing about myself for many years now. But that was the start. When I read that book, The Occult, I just thought, this is just brilliant stuff. And so at the same time as I just was starting to play, in Blondie, I was starting to get interest in this stuff. And the two came together in 77 because that was when I wrote a song um, called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear." That became a big hit for Blondie in 78. It's a while ago, kids. Mostly in the UK and Europe, not so much in the States. But this is before they got really big with Heart of Glass and all that. Which incidentally, back in the old days, I played on, and we just called it the disco song. It was just some throwaway kind of thing. Then they reinvented it as this big hit. But in any case, I'm always touched by your presence there. It was about these strange shared dreams and telepathic kind of experiences I had with my girlfriend at the time. We were on tour, the first Blondie tour. We were support for Iggy Pop,
Mhm.
who was making a comeback, and David Bowie had sort of revived him. And actually, Bowie was playing in Iggy's band. He was playing keyboards, but he was unannounced. So it was this kind of, secret kind of thing. And again, this is
Yeah.
long before the internet or mobile
Mhm.
phones or anything. So it was all, did you hear some fanzine or something? You would
Yeah.
see that. Oh wow, Um, any case, yeah. So we did this tour, and my girlfriend was in New York, and I was wherever we were. And then we just discovered that when one of us wanted to call the other had the same feeling to do it. And again, back then it was a mobile phone, so you had to, what time is it in
Yeah.
Detroit or whatever, where is he? Where's the hotel? And that kind of thing.
Hopefully they're
And then we
there.
then we started talking. We seemed like we were having the same
Yeah.
kinds of dreams. So this is what I wrote the song about. So that's really my real start in the sort of thing I write about. The first thing I wrote about it in that sense was a song.
Oh wow. So it's super interesting, kind of like picking up the information and kind of like translating it into music pretty immediately. Was that kind of like a part of the plan, or did you
It was
think
a
that?
lot. I mean, no, I mean, when you write songs like that, they just come out, at least with me.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to write funny experiences. Then I just picked up the guitar and I was strumming a chord, and then like the lyrics was a destiny. I don't know yet, but then
Yeah.
being a writer of doggerel, okay, what rhymes with that? And then, oh, was it just by chance? Could it be kismet? That was then. So once I had that going, and then it all came out. So when I wrote songs, they either all came out or I had bits and pieces. So I was never like what they call a songsmith, where you
Yeah.
can kind of, okay, bang it out and you put it together and it works or something. It was all kind of spontaneous, and that's what that was. It all kind of came out like that. And then later on, a year or two down the line, because I started reading about all this stuff.
Hmm.
That was New York in the 70s in that time was a good place to be interested in this kind of thing because all the bookshops had sections on it. There had been what's called the occult revival of the 1960s, which I wrote about in my first book called Turn
Hmm.
Off Your Mind, the dark side of mystic 60s and the dark side of the age of Aquarius. So and there was a lot of reprints of works that were in public domain, so they were cheap. So classic stuff from like 19th century you could get in cheap editions and all the cutout bins. So I just started buying all this stuff. And One of the things I started reading about, there was a book called An Experiment with Time by a fellow named J.W. Dunn. It was written in the 1920s, and he wasn't an occultist, he was an aeronautics engineer. But he had discovered by chance that bits and pieces of his future were turning up in his dreams.
Oh, wow.
And So it wasn't like he was predicting the future. It just would, something he saw in the newspaper. He saw it in the dream first, and then saw it in the newspaper, 2 days later or something like that. And there's some quite remarkable accounts of these things. But basically, he said, if you find out for yourself, because he thought this was something that everyone more or less experiences, or but doesn't notice it because they don't pay attention to their dreams. And if they do, they might say, well, that's funny, but you don't really think about it too much. And if you mention it to your friends, they say, oh, that kind of thing. So I just started saying, okay,
Yeah.
I just started writing my dreams down. And man, bang on pretty quickly, what he said was happening. And I mean, the first one I remember, so I dreamt that I was playing a red guitar. And at the time I didn't have one. I didn't know
Mhm.
anyone who had one, like a very, very bright red guitar. And it just in New York, just walking, around with a friend, and then we met somebody else, and we wound up going to somebody else's place, and then you're sitting down, and musicians, so they know you musicians, and somebody said, "Here, check this out," and the guy hands me this red Stratocaster, and it's
Mhm.
like, I start strumming. I thought, "Oh God, this is the guitar in the dream. This is exactly the guitar in the dream." And so I had a couple other experiences like that, and
Wow.
so I more or less been recording my dreams off and on since then, so a good 40 plus years. And
Yeah.
I did a book a couple of years ago called Dreaming Ahead of Time, which is about my experiences with precognitive dreams and other sort of temporal anomalies.
So did that kind of start like the whole bridge into like becoming an author and writing books, starting that whole process, or
Well, my interest in this sort of stuff started then.
okay.
But I was when did I dropped out of music about the end of 81, so beginning of 82. I had my own band called The No in Los Angeles. We started in LA, but we were a bi-coastal band, so we were in LA and New York.
Okay.
And The No, KNOW, and that came from my interest in Gnosticism, or what I was
Yeah.
reading about
Hmm.
Gnosticism back then. And the Gnostics were a early Christian sect, or could very well be they were the true Christians, and the official church, the Petrine Church, was sort of the heretical sect that kind of got usurped power and whatever. There's arguments about that. Elaine Pagels wrote this wonderful book just called The Gnostic Gospels that I remember reading things late 70s.
Hmm.
And Jung has written about them, and the whole idea of gnosis, of knowledge, which is a Greek word for knowledge, but it's knowledge that's like an immediate experience. So it's a kind of experiential knowledge,
Yeah.
sudden, rather than painstaking, slowly learning something, or studying something or research kind of like that. It's just kind of like bang. It's the same sort of thing as on a very hot day and you're very thirsty and you take a cold drink and bang, you don't. It's undeniably your thirst is quenched. You don't have to. Oh yes, how do I? Yes, I know. It's like bang. So gnosis is like that. And
Yeah.
so I was interested in that sort of thing, and I had also by the late seven, yeah, when I went to LA, I got involved for brief time for a few months, a bit more maybe, with a Crowley group in Los Angeles, branch of his OTO, which is the Ordo Templi Orientis. So I was always, I mean, I was eager to experiment and discover and find out, and so I just check it out. So I had
Yeah.
that kind of scientific attitude towards it. So I was doing some rituals or experiments and different sorts of things, and slowly, from a early naive, eager enthusiasm, slowly over much time, it became a bit more, I'd hate to say serious because it sounds boring or presumptuous, but I just became more interested in the broader kind of sense. But it took me a long time between stop when I left music, which would have been after doing 2 tours with Iggy Pop in
Hmm.
1981, and been going back and forth between LA and New York throughout like the late 70s, early 80s, and finally going back to LA, 82. And then I was okay, I was no longer doing music.
Yeah.
And I had the luxury of having earned substantial royalties for the song Presence Dear.
Wow.
So for a while, I didn't have to worry about anything. So I just read and I traveled. And I went on with a friend. We went on what I called a mini search for the miraculous. And we went over to living in LA. We went over to Europe and went to places like Chartres Cathedral and Notre Dame in Paris and Glastonbury in England, Stonehenge and Avebury, these ancient megalithic
Hmm.
sites. But also because I'd become very interested in the Gurdjieff
Yeah.
work. It's called the Fourth Way. It's called the Work, and Gurdjieff was this enigmatic Greco-Armenian esoteric teacher in the 20th century, and this most well-known sort of exponent, sort of Russian writer named Peter Uspensky. And I became very interested in them, mostly because of Colin Wilson wrote very well and clearly about them and their ideas and linked them up with other sorts of ideas. And I got into it sort of towards the way that he tried to explain it, but then I decided to just in the same way that I experimented with this Crowley group, I decided to go and do that. And I had a longer
Mhm.
tenure with that. I was involved in that for a few years. But I mention it because part of this mini search for miraculous in the 1920s in Fontainebleau, outside of Paris, Gurdjieff had what he called his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And it was on this huge but rundown chateau, and he had students from England and other places come there. And it's a long story. I've written about it in a couple of books.
Okay.
But we found this place. So
Yeah.
like 40 years after it, 40 maybe, well, no, probably more than that, maybe almost like 60 years after it was open. My friend and I, we found it. It wasn't what it was anymore. It just was
Hmm.
this chateau was all boarded up in that. So it was that kind of trip. And then when I came back, what am I going to do? I wanted to write, but I couldn't write anything yet. It took me a long time to learn how to write. But I decided to go back to university, and my career change was from rock and roll was I was going to teach philosophy.
Oh wow.
So yeah,
It's a heck of a change.
yeah.
Um,
Well, that's what my professors thought. They thought it was incomprehensible. They said,
yeah.
"What you want to do? This is boring, absolutely boring. What we do. You can't do anything else with the philosophy degree except teach philosophy. There's nothing you can do with it except. But I was
Hmm.
very fired up, with the power of ideas from reading all about. Well, again, mostly through Colin Wilson's work because he he opened up ideas about consciousness
Yeah.
and our experience of it and altered states, but also our everyday kind of consciousness. And he brings in things like existentialism and all these variety of different kinds of um, psychological sort of states that we experience throughout the day. And I just became fascinated with all of that. So that I wanted to understand all that, and I had the great luxury of being able to devote myself to the life of ideas. And that's what I did then. And yeah, during that time, I was earning that degree. I For a good part of it, I was working uh, at the time is probably the most famous New Age bookshop around in the States, at least. It's a place called the Bodhi Tree. It was in Los
Mm.
Angeles, and it had come to sort of wide recognition. If you don't remember the actress Shirley MacLaine back in the
Okay.
old days, you might know. Yeah, yeah. probably not your
Yeah.
generation, but she was a film and actress, very well known, but she became very, very interested in things like past lives
Okay.
and reincarnation and a variety of other what we would call new age kinds of concerns.
Hmm.
And this bookshop started up in the early 70s. It was mostly sort of with Bodhi trees. So it was kind of Buddhist oriented and meditation and that sort of thing. But it was a place to go where you could find lots of different things associated with a variety of spiritual practices.
Hmm.
And she started frequenting this shop, and then she wrote about it in the book. And then there was a mini series on television in the late 80s called Out on a Limb, I think, or something like that, if I remember correctly, where she talks about going to the shop. And then it was on the map. And
Oh,
it started, lots and lots, and like celebrities. And so it was like, this is kind of like popular new age, sort of really got going then. And
yeah.
at the time, I started working there in 87, again, it's a long time ago, but there was something
Mhm.
called the harmonic convergence that was starting up then, was this kind of millenarian cosmic event, the denouement of
Okay.
which was 2012, which not too long ago. And I don't know if you were aware, there was all this excitement about some sort of millennial event happening
Yeah.
on 2012.
Mhm.
2012 was supposed to be sort of the outcome of this thing called the harmonic convergence, and I think it's like 25 years between them. Nothing happened out of either of them, but when but at the bookshop, it was, oh my god, it was like very, very exciting rooms, all, that's when I started working there. So at the same
Yeah.
time, as strange enough, I'm like studying Hegel and Wittgenstein. I'm also in this bookshop and talking to people about crystals and auras. And so it was a very strange kind of dichotomy between these two different sorts of things. And but I think down the line,
Okay.
um, that helped because in a sense, I sort of try to bring a kind of philosophical clarity uh, to these ideas that often, may come across as very vague and that sort of thing. But yeah, but it was at that bookshop that I started writing because they had it was something called the Bodhi Tree Review, and it was like a catalog. Um, and they had book reviews. And so they asked me if I would, wanted to write some book reviews. So I did. And
Hmm.
one was a book called The Passion of the Western Mind. There's a fellow named Richard Tarnas. Oh, he's still around. He's a brilliant philosopher and historian of ideas. And he was associated with the Esalen Institute for many years. That's if you're in Big Sur in California on the coast.
Okay.
It started up in the 60s. It was like one of the first kind of meditation or alternative kind of retreat centers. Now there's many of them, but when it started up, it was one of the first ones, and many people, very, very famous names associated with that milieu, were there and gave classes there and all that.
Hmm.
But he wrote this book called Passion of the Western Mind, and it was sort of more or less an overview of the West, um, from the point of view of its kind of take the end of it taking itself apart through deconstructionism and postmodernism. But he which initially seems nihilistic, but from him it was a sign that the Western mindset, the kind of what we might call left brain, or very intellectual mindset, it played out,
Hmm.
and it was taking itself apart with any luck in preparation for some sort of renewal. So I wrote positive review of that. He liked the review. He came to the shop and he met me, and then he asked me to contribute to a journal called Revision that he was editing. And then yeah, after that, I just started
Wow.
writing articles and book reviews and magazines. And but it wasn't until I moved here to London in '96 that I really started writing full time, like being a writer in that
Yeah.
sense. And the last thing I did in LA is I worked at that bookshop. Well, this in short order, I'll say my life changed drastically. I left the bookshop, got married, and then I wound up trying to find a place for myself.
Hmm.
So thought I was going to teach philosophy, but I got married and that interfered with that. And I thought, okay, I would do an English degree. And I did 1 year of an MA degree at USC, but that was a complete mistake. And then I worked for about a year as a science writer. She never got the job, but
Hmm.
at UCLA, based on the strength of some articles on pop science and chaos theory or complexity or things like that, book reviews. But everything fell apart because I really, really wanted to write, like,
Yeah.
just what I wanted to write,
Hmm.
not only use my talents and abilities, in the service of others for a very, good salary and all that sort of thing. So I
Yeah.
was living this kind of one way, like a very, good life. I had a good job, a wonderful woman I was married to. We had a nice big flat in a sort of gated community in LA, and I had this an office and a parking space and blah, 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 blah. But then I remember walking across the campus one day thinking, well, I should be happy, but you're not, are you? I said, no. It's sort of
Yeah.
geyser of unsatisfaction and frustration came up, and then everything fell apart. I mean, this is all in this memoir.
Hmm.
Everything fell apart. So marriage came apart. I lost the job. But that's what I wanted actually. And but the collapse of all that was at the end of 1995. The shockwave from the collapse of that threw me across not only the country but the Atlantic, and I wound up coming here because I'd met some people here on a trip just towards the end of '95, and just became friends. And they suggested, if I told them my sad story and all this, and they said, well, if you want to change the scenery, come to London for a while, we can put you up and blah blah blah. So I came just thinking, okay, let's check it out. And that was the beginning of '96, January '96, and I've just been here since.
So you mentioned like the whole occult like revival like in the 60s and 70s. Did you get to experience that any like firsthand?
Well, I mean, just
Sure,
insofar that
probably.
I was,
Yeah.
reading about it and
Hmm.
discovered it. I said it wasn't
Yeah.
until '75, but
Hmm.
I wound up writing about that just here in London.
Yeah.
Again, it's about 90. I came at the beginning, so it must have been around '97. I went to well in '67. There was something called the Technicolor Dream. I can't remember what it was exactly thing. It was like a big psychedelic kind of concert that happened in an area of North London, some place called Alexandra Palace. And like the Pink Floyd played and Soft Machine and a bunch of other bands and all that. So in London, there's something called the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and they held like a kind of memorial, day about that, talking about this event.
Hmm.
And someone I knew at the time, a fellow named Michael Harvitz, was a poet from that time. I didn't know him then. I only met him coming here, but he was kind of mover and shaker on sort of the beat poetry scene in the late '60s in London, and he invited me to come along to this thing. And I remember at some point, I forget what happened. I made some kind of remark about something. I don't even remember what I said. It must have been brilliant because somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, we're doing a 1960s, conference at Wolverhampton University." I had no idea what that was, and they said, "Would you like to give a talk?" So of course I said yes. I'd never given a talk before, but I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do that." And so when they sent me like what people were doing, uh, I kind of looked at it was mostly political sort of things, like May '68. In the
Hmm.
Paris, the student riots that brought the city to well, almost the whole country to a standstill for a while. But I would say, well, I was a kid in the '60s, so I didn't even know anything about that.
Yeah.
But what I remember was, popular culture.
Hmm.
And when I think about it now, there was a lot of occult kind of stuff in television and films and comic books and things of
Yeah.
that sort. And so I just gave a talk about that.
Oh,
And
wow.
somebody in the audience was an editor, academic was an editor for Macmillan, he's one of the publishers. And he said, "Oh, I liked your talk. I think you got an idea for a book there. How do you feel about like putting a proposal together? I'll send it to people I know at Macmillan." So I did that. And then when it came out that I had played in Blondie, they said, "Oh, would you like to write something about that?" So I said, "Sure." So I also wrote. So I got two books, a contract for two books in one. And the second book was called New York Rocker: My Life in the Blank Generation. And that was a memoir of my time in music. So
Mhm.
with this new one, it's called Touched by the Presence, the title coming from the song. That's sort of like what was before that, and then it's the Blondie bit in there, and then what was after. So
Mhm.
it's like all the different influences on that led me leaving the States and coming here. So that tragic story I just said about my life falling apart. So that's kind of, the big event at the end that, sends me across. But I, um, yeah, there just was so much of that around, and so I got
Yeah.
asked to write this book about it. So I did a lot of research on it, and I didn't start out wanting it to be about the dark side, but the more I looked into it, there were more and more kind of resonances with, well, unfortunately, something like the lead up to the National Socialism in Germany in 1930s, because they had a lot of strange ideas going on, and there was this kind of the notion of, the revolt against the rational in a way, or the eruption of the irrational.
Okay.
There's a book called The Morning of the Magicians that came out in the early 60s in for France. And actually that kick-started this occult revival, because it was the first really, really best-selling popular book about this kind of thing,
Mhm.
in modern sort of times. And but they talk about something called absolute elsewhere, and it's this notion what we would call singularity, somewhere where all the usual rules and all the usual, patterns and causal relations are, abrogated. They don't work anymore. And in the background to, National Socialism's rise and all that, they, many of the people in power there had some very, very strange and crazy ideas, racial ideas, but also other ideas, and the
Mhm.
hollow earth and things like that they took seriously, much like today,
Yeah. A
with,
lot of
a
these
lot of the
series.
far right, and you have the
Yeah.
far out and the far right get together, and you have all these, and I tell you, it's, what do you want to say, it's over here, um seeing what's happened. And I'm an American, but I've been here for, almost 30 years now,
Yeah.
and it's just, I'm not surprised in one sense, because I did a book on Trump that came out in
Yeah.
2018. This is about his first uh, administration. But I am like, I can't believe it's actually become what it has, become. And
Yeah.
it is like the triumph of all this kind of weird, strange kind of stuff. And we tend, if we're interested in the occult, if we're interested in the strange and the
Mhm.
esoteric, we tend to feel like, oh, the rational or the scientific is somehow a little too inhibiting, or it cramps, or it's whatever. But now, oh my God, with the nuttiness that's available and in power, it's like it's see, this is the thing. People
Need some normalcy.
thing. I'm sorry.
I said, need some normalcy, I would say, or search
Well,
for
it's
some
just,
normalcy.
it's fortunately it swings from extremes to extreme. You rarely get,
True. Yeah.
this middle point where you have, yes, just the right amount of rationality and just the right amount of the spontaneous, creative side. But if you go too much on that side, it's too crazy. That side, it's too controlled and sterile. So
Yeah.
that's, in each of us that happens, but it also is, culturally and sort of historically. But I mean, I've written about this. I think all of this, uh, almost. I mean, the previous election, that was when Trump first came. The premise of this book was that somehow people on the alt right, you never hear about them anymore. They were like, really popular about 6 7 years, whatever, however many years
Yeah.
ago, in Cosmopolitan. But they were using somehow magical means on the internet to help Trump win and all this kind of weird thing. And then he had people like Steve Bannon around him, who's very much a reader of this far right esoteric philosopher named Julius Evola, Italian from the 20th century. he belongs to a school known as traditionalism, but they have very, very far right, political ideas. He tried to ingratiate himself with Mussolini and National Socialism and all that. And so, as a fellow still around today in Russia, this guy Alexander Dugin, who's part of this strange far right traditionalist chaos magic, weird esoteric political kind of network, who's still around, and he's at different times and levels he's got Putin's ear, or at least the ear of someone who can relay what he had said to Putin and all that. So it's all the stuff that used to be on the fringe suddenly seems to have come like smack in the middle now, and and it isn't what people expected it. People, oh yes, magic is true, or oh yes, thoughts are things, and yes, positive thinking. Well, it's not positive in the sense that it's good. It's positive in the sense that's all you think about. It's like you stick to that and you focus on that. So it's all goal oriented. It's not positive in the sense that I'm very positive. Oh, Trump is a very positive guy. If you ever listen to him talk, it's always yes. Yes, they will. They'll do it. It'll happen. It'll be great. It's the best. It's the most fantastic. It's what I'm saying. He's always on message. And he's always he'll never. I mean, after the fact, he made whatever with the tariffs, but when he's talking, it's always that. And that's the positive side of it. You narrow-mindedly, monomaniacally focus on one thing, and you block out all the other possible realities. And whether that makes it happen or whether somehow you can bully everyone around you because you're doing that makes it happen. It does seem to get some results going. So this is all this weird kind of stuff that and I think this is why whatever you're going to call it, the left, the progressives, the other, they don't quite get it because they don't understand that this kind of mindset's behind. And I think the other thing is that however dubious, Trump gives his supporters a sense of meaning. They feel they're part of some large, movement, some kind of glorious sort of thing. And if you fill somebody with that kind of feeling, it's like it's difficult to argue or get any kind of argument against. And doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he says. Doesn't matter. That's like, and it's so all that stuff is all this. It's occult, psychological, whatever you want to call it, but it's not the usual political sorts of motivations at work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all kinds of kind of wild stuff going on, especially with that. And I can't even imagine in the background through all of that chaos as well. What were some of the most wild things that you found amongst that whole occult revival, like in the 60s and 70s, that you wrote about? What were some of the most interesting that you kind of came across?
You could say, the fact that the most famous people in the world at the time, the Beatles, put Crowley, Elsa Crowley on the cover of Sergeant Pepper. Also, C.G. Jung, the psychologist who was at the time, actually, he was talking about the age of Aquarius in the 1940s, and he was predicting, this is what the 60s was known as the age of Aquarius, dawning of the age of Aquarius, which is, again, supposed to be this wonderful millenarian time of peace and love, and they, produced Manson in the end, and that Rolling Stones concert at Altamont, where the Hells Angels, wound up killing one person and then terrorizing, the whole kind of small hippie city stuck inside a raceway stadium. So that kind of general background to the kind of what should we say? And in saying that, I'm not just saying oh there's dark forces at work. I think the 60s kind of sensibility, I call it liberationist. The whole idea of get rid of all repression. That Crowley was talking about that during his heyday in the 1920s and all that. Do with that wilt, and he was picked up by the sort of counterculture in the mid 60s. Here in England, there was a newspaper called the International Times, IT. It's called Underground. When there was an underground, but I did like a half-page piece on him as a kind of proto-hippie, mostly because of his he took lots of drugs and he was polysexual and giving the finger to the establishment and all that kind of thing. So less so the magic stuff. Magic was kind of the context in which he did all that, but it was sort of the hedonistic kind of and liberationist kind of sensibility. So he became a kind of poster boy, and then that's how the Beatles found out about him, and then the Rolling Stones, so, and obviously other people like Jimmy Page. So his influence permeated a lot of the rock at that time, and it's still around, kind of in heavy metal places, and even rap singers. I mean, I'm not up on all that contemporary, but I did a book on Crowley, and part of it was about why did he remain a kind of pop icon when a lot of others who were around at the time in the 60s from that kind of milieu, like Madame Blavatsky and others who were Jung. I mean, they didn't continue on as kind of like um, figures for like pop culture figure, but Crowley stayed on mostly because this had the drugs and the wildness and all that. But then there was sort of like a revival of interest in magic and with some rappers, I mean, it's again nowadays it's around all the time, so it's kind of like
Yeah.
I just see it everywhere, like, and it's like, and it's kind of like it's like it doesn't, it's weird because it doesn't have any of the kind of, what do you want to call it, challenging character that it had at an earlier time, and it wasn't so you know um, present everywhere. But now it just seems to be present everywhere. But I mean, back then it had a threatening character, and this was one of the things about the 60s, because you had this drug, psychedelic revolution, and you had civil rights, and then sort of sexual revolution and the anti-war, and there's a variety of different kinds of revolutions or challenges, and the occult became part of that for a while, and it had a threatening character. I mean, even during the again 1960s, you have a version of occult politics when it was the March on Washington, the anti-Vietnam War March.
Hmm.
And part of this was, well, these people wanted to encircle the Pentagon, and they were going to try to levitate it, right? They were going to mentally levitate the Pentagon. And the police, or guards, they said, well, look, we can't let you circle it, but if you want to levitate, that's okay, go ahead. But then they also were exercising it as well. And there's I don't know if you know, again, Kenneth Anger. He was avant-garde filmmaker who was very, very interested in Crowley, and
Hmm.
he did films. Lucifer Rising is probably his most famous one, but he did films. Mick Jagger was in some of them, and Jimmy Page contributed some music. And oddly enough, one of the people he was involved with, a fellow named Bobby Beausoleil, he was one of Manson's family. So he did music while he was still doing a life sentence in California jail for murder. Strange crowd.
Oh,
But Kenneth
yeah.
Anger, the novelist Norman Mailer, a guy named Ed Sanders, who had a band called the Fugs. And they were called the Fugs because you couldn't really say the F word back
Mhm.
then. And he got the word fug from Mailer's book, The Naked and the Dead, which is a novel of his about soldiers. And
Mhm.
instead of saying effing, they say fugging all the time. So, but they're on a flatbed truck and they're shouting out demons, out, out, exercising the Pentagon. So you have all this, strange occult kind of politics. And then
Yeah.
with the yippies, who were like, even, they were more radical. Their kind of central thing was doing inversions or reversions of things. So you walk on red lights, don't walk on green lights, or say yes when you mean no. So it was weird, magical thinking. It was all kind of more conceptual than any kind of thing that had any really effect. But that itself was just kind of like, that's a standard kind of black magic
Yeah.
tactic where when the black mass, it's just the inversion of the Catholic mass. So you just do the opposite, and that kind of thing. So all that kind of stuff was like, so it was in the air, so it was something that, permeated pretty much everything for a while. And then like I said, it all blew up by the end of the 60s with the Manson murders and the Altamont. And then there was that strange group, the Process. They were another, they were this kind of satanic group that infiltrated areas of like the swinging London
So
and all of that.
yes,
And
do you think groups like that kind of, in a way, hijack the kind of movement and give it that kind of negative?
well, I don't know. I don't think so because again, it was you think of it in terms of inverting. So
Oh,
you even
true.
had like folk singers like Buffy St. Marie or somebody like that saying, "I believe in Abraxas," and Abraxas is this Gnostic deity who combines good and evil. So it was this kind of beyond beyond good and evil. That's Nietzsche's books, and technically that's known as antinomianism, which was you are against the rules, the norms, the gnomes. So you're against that. So you and you can see throughout history different groups at different times claim that they had achieved a kind of spiritual freedom or liberation, and they were no longer constrained by the everyday morality of the time. So in the medieval times, there were a group called the Brethren of the Free Spirit, and they had believed that the second coming had happened already, and Jesus had come back, and so everything was transformed, and they no longer had to follow all the rules of the church and all that kind of stuff. And so you have different groups like that. So this is why the church throughout history has always been against enthusiasm. They don't want you to be, no, we're in charge. Let us take care of it. You
Yeah.
just follow the rules. And so enthuse just means, it means the God in. The
Hmm.
theos is in you. And you suddenly became, every time I feel the spirit rising in my soul, I will sing. And that, no, 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 no. We don't want you singing. We want you to, and so the Gnostics were sort of like that in the early days because they, rather than believe in the dogma or not so much I believe in Jesus. I believe
Hmm.
that Jesus has, died for my sins. He said, well, I, I have experienced the same kind of spiritual struggle and suffering that Jesus has experienced himself. Not literally crucified, but that's a symbol anyway. See, the Gnostics took all that symbolically. The Petrine Church took it literally. So you did have lots of Christians in the early days of when the Christians were persecuted, they were happily going to the lions because they thought if they suffered and died, they're going to heaven, like just like evangelical or fundamentalists, many of them today, sadly, who are very close to the seat of power. This is the other scary thing about what's happening now. So all these
Yeah.
very literal-minded people in now occupying or at least close to those who occupy places of power. So, but yeah, so but this is what the difference you would have. So you'd have the hippies were doing something like that in different ways too. They
Yeah.
had passed beyond. But when you pass beyond good and evil, it's hard to know whether you're doing that as a sinner or as a saint. It's
Yeah.
really difficult to tell anymore.
Yeah.
And Manson, who actually in many ways did come across as kind of like a Jesus-like figure, he was small, he was actually kind of humble, uh, people around him said he radiated love, but then he, led to hideous mass killings, or so
Yeah.
this is you can understand in one sense the church concern about enthusiasm because once you
Yeah.
once you get off the guide rails, as they say these days, there's no way of knowing where you're going to go. So this was, I think, that whole sensibility, because the whole like the 60s, not so much exactly in some occult fashion, but the whole idea was, yeah, unbutton, like, oh, the button down 50s, let's let it all hang out. And initially that's remarkably, liberating and refreshing. You feel really good because most of us are repressed. So, but then after a while, it's like, what's next?
Yeah.
After you've unrepressed everything, what's the constructive sort of thing? And they didn't really have anything for that because they didn't see beyond being
You know,
free of being
yeah,
free of the
that
constraints.
kind of reminds me of a conversation I just had with Ronnie Pontiac about Manly P. Hall. He said he wasn't like a huge fan of like rock music or loud guitars, or that kind of music at that time period because he said it was like awakening their soul, or he had thought that it was like awakening their soul or their being. and just leaving them out there to be kind of
Hmm.
exposed in a way to these people kind of taking it.
Cool. But then Elvis Presley was a big fan of Manly P. Hall. So
Really?
I wonder if they ever talked about that. But
Man,
actually,
yeah,
when I lived in LA in the late '70s, I saw Manly P. Hall talk a few times at the
really.
Philosophical Research Society. And then there's another fellow named Stefan Heller who's still around. He's in his 90s, and he used to give talks about Gnosticism. And he's a bishop in the Gnostic Church in Hollywood, and he still gives talk up in the excuse me, in Hollywood Hills. Actually, when the fires recently, there's the Annie Besant Lodge of the Theosophical Society up in Beechwood Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. I know it. I've been up there.
Hmm.
And the fires in LA, they came relatively close to all that. And I was concerned,
Yeah.
but it wasn't touched. So that was good. But no, I think well, it goes back to Plato. Plato's Republic. He's concerned about the kind of music that is played. He said some music is very good, it keeps you marching in step, but other kind it creates kind of passions that are uncontrolled.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of seen as an early kind of authoritarian. Okay, for the good of the republic, for the good of the stable, orderly run of things, we have to dampen down some of these the passions that the poets or the music
Yeah.
excuse me. So it all depends. Nietzsche, art, and the philosopher Nietzsche, 2,000 years later, argued differently. No, we have to give right, release these energies, the Dionysian forces, and that's why he was a great lover of music. And he equated Wagner's operas with the ancient mysteries, the ancient sort of Dionysian mysteries, and all that. So, okay, you have the two sides.
Yeah.
It's Apollo, Dionysus, left and right brain, yin and yang. It's these two sides. The thing is to get them into the optimum creative tension and polarity, which is easier said than done.
With the whole rise in the 60s and 70s, was there like some sort of bridge like after like the whole movement in Nazi Germany kind of died down?
Well, I think what happened the end with the end of the '60s or '70s is you kind
Mhm.
of got the way I look at it, sort of the occult stream bifurcated, and so in one sense you had all the heavy metal stuff, Black Sabbath, and then bands like Metallica and others, and tons more I know nothing about, who embraced that Satanism or black magic or all that kind of stuff in different ways, and that became a kind of recognizable genre. So rather than all pervaded, it became a recognizable genre. And then the other side, the good side, was kind of the beginning of the new age.
Yeah.
What became humbly starts in the '70s and then picks up steam in the '80s and all that, and that's more spiritual, love-minded, meditation, Eastern sort of oriented, and things of that sort. So I think in that way, and then the general sense, after the '60s and '70s, is this grittiness, all the flower power and all that kind of stuff. You see the film, like the early '70s films, are like very, very gritty. It's dark. It's
Yeah.
all kind urban, and it's not. It doesn't have that sensibility anymore.
Yeah.
It's cynical, like hard boiled, kind of pulp detective fiction in a way. So that sensibility changes. And I mean, I know when I was in New York, a musician then, I mean, I was interested in this stuff, but I didn't know many of the people, or if they were, it was kind of like, kitschy,
Yeah.
background, just kind of fun stuff. But
Yeah.
I subsequently learned, I mean, I know there were, other things going on. There was like, groups going on, but I myself, I wasn't particularly interested.
Yeah.
And my experience of getting involved with groups, the Crowley group I got involved with in LA was just kind of, in the end, was just sort of like just a Crowley fan club,
Yeah.
and it was particularly interesting. And the sad part is like, people involved emulated the worst aspects of Crowley. So,
Yeah.
people like to say, do what thou wilt, but actually it's like, well, I'll do what I want or do what you like. And, oh, well, I'm sorry if that bothers you, you've somehow come into my orbit and you have to sort of, it's, oh God, so I quickly learn that. I mean, I'm fairly open-minded. Then I give people the benefit of the doubt. I want to learn, but after a
Yeah.
while you sort of get it. So that aspect of it, I think, became too. So
Yeah, kind of
it's
involvement
yeah,
and
yeah. But I
everything.
think the thing now is it's all kind of nicely packaged,
Yeah.
So and again, there isn't the counterculture, there isn't the underground, where at one point there was
Yeah.
that or something like that.
Hmm.
Whereas now it's multicultural everything, and especially through the internet,
Yeah.
people can pursue any number of interesting kind of topics. So
Yeah, some of my favorite things that you brought up, that kind of, I guess, were unexpected were about Madame Blavatsky and her influence on Gandhi.
yeah, well, this hardly ever gets mentioned. But when Gandhi was in London, basically, studying to be a lawyer, um, he bumped into these two fellows who were theosophists, and they were keen about anything to do with India and all that. And so they were happy to meet him. And then they started talking about the Bhagavad Gita, this wonderful, Hindu text and sacred text. And they said, wouldn't it be wonderful? All of us, we could read it together in the original language. And Gandhi had to admit, well, I've never read it, in any language. And this is because when he was brought up by the Christian missionaries, they said it was all rubbish. This is no, no, no. It's Jesus and Christianity. So they said, well, in that case, you must meet Madame Blavatsky. And actually, where I live in London, she didn't live too far away from where I live in London.
Wow.
This would have been 1890, something like that. And they walked him over there, and he met her, and she introduced him to Bhagavad Gita and all of that. And he was introduced to his own culture through her. So and she's a white European, Russian, who, when she was in India, she went native. I mean, and she always gets kind of criticized being racist and all that. And she talks about root races in
Yeah.
secret doctrine, but in her own life, she wasn't like that at all. I mean, when she lived in India, she hated the Raj, she hated the whites and the Brits, and she hung out with the locals and all of that. And she converted to Buddhism and a variety of other things. So, but yeah, she had an enormous influence on him, and until end of his life, he even says one of the last things he wrote was something like, Hinduism is theosophy in action, and theosophy is Hinduism in thought, or something like that. And he wasn't so much interested in, again, the occult side of it, but what he
Yeah.
appreciated about the Theosophical Society was its mission to actually create a kind of real brotherhood of man, or brotherhood of people,
Yeah.
brother and sisterhood, whatever, however I
Hmm.
have to qualify it these days, but which is just the old Masonic idea,
Yeah.
of regardless of race, creed, economic stature, whatever. And this is something he felt as well, and this was something she tried to do, and she even she hints in her writing about this was a plan that had started back in the 18th century with the masonry then, and her grandfather was involved with Russian Freemasonry. And I write about this a little bit in my book about Russia, The Return of Holy Russia. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting.
and also, I mean,
Was
she had enormous influence on modern art and people like that. So people like Kandinsky and and modern painters are very interested in our ideas about other dimensions and things of that sort. So yeah, I mean, and it's only in fairly recent times that a lot of this has come to light, like the influence of this occult or hermetic tradition on a great deal of modern culture. It was like sort of ignored for a long time. So
yeah.
I say in the last 20, 30 years, it's become more prominent.
Why do you think it was that she got like such like kind of, I guess, historically maybe a bad rap? Was it because like
Well,
Hitler was
there was
looking at?
one, yeah, yeah, sorry, there was, well, she was investigated once, by a member of the Society for Psychical Research, because the claim was about what they call these materializations. And the most thing was some these strange things that they called the Mahatma letters. So there would be letters, paper handwriting on it would
Hmm.
materialize, like fall from the ceiling or turn up in places they shouldn't have been. And the idea is that these are actually transports, from the masters who were two Hindus, but who operated out of a secret monastery in Tibet. So all that's a bit, difficult to swallow. But while she was in India, a disgruntled employee uh, sold a story about how this is all fake and it was all a fraud and all this kind of stuff. And to a Christian missionary newspaper. And the Christian missionary newspaper was happy to get anything because they hated her because she was always telling the Hindus, no, go back to your own culture, forget about Christianity. And so she didn't like, the Christians, trying to colonize basically. So they had every reason to take any kind of mud, slung at her, and make it stick. And so Richard Hodgson was the fellow who was sent over to investigate, but she wasn't there when he arrived. And he only interviewed people and he only spoke to people who were critical. So, but at the end, he said, he said she was a remarkable, individual, but, this is one of the great frauds, of our time. And he claimed she was a Russian spy. And that actually angered her more than anything else. That she was accused of being a Russian spy, and she wanted to contest the whole thing, but the society said, well, no, actually, you would go to court, and then you'd have to produce the masters and all this kind of stuff, and it would never happen. And so she decided, for the good of the society, to leave India, and that's she went on her last years, sort of wandering through Europe, and ended up here.
Yeah.
But what was the thing handed down was that, yeah, she was a phony. But what I say in the book is that quite some time later, maybe a century later, um, someone in the Society of Psychical Research went over all the evidence in this case and said, well, this is actually, it's all very shaky. This is an unproven, you know, uncovering. He's not saying
Yeah.
she wasn't, but this doesn't prove that she was, and it's so they withdrew it. So, but I think the difficult thing to do is once you're called something, and it's been repeated enough times, it's really, really difficult to get, people not to see that. And that's one of the
Yeah.
things I tried to do in that book is I just said, because I never really paid that much attention to her. And then I got commissioned to do the book, and then I started doing the reading research. Oh, she's actually more interesting than I thought. And
Yeah.
there's all this stuff that gets repeated is not like that get repeated that she was a hashish addict and smoked. She didn't. She smoked a lot of cigarettes, tobacco. She rolled her own,
Yeah.
but she didn't smoke hash or anything like that. So she's teetotal, celibate, and all that. She was a free thinking humanist in the mid 19th to late 19th century, and I'm surprised feminists didn't get onto her because she was doing things then that no one else was doing. So she was remarkable. But I guess this occult stain and all that kind of stuff makes it untouchable.
We'll end it with that. Thank you for taking the time. Hope to
Yeah, my
catch up
pleasure.
soon.
My pleasure.
Listen close, it's the occult folk. It's the occult folk.